the reason why I still want to mention this is because I'm wondering about that idea or that notion of dehumanizing math. When you hear me say dehumanizing math, what comes to mind? Do you believe that, or are you like, I've never heard that before, and that's not my experience? Dehumanizing math. Or, maybe we should focus on what we want, humanizing mathematics.
When I think of it, like a lot of times, like parents will even come in and say, well, I wasn't really good at math, so I didn't understand why they weren't good at math. Like this whole identity of I'm not good at something, so I can't do it.
Yeah. So being very cognizant of the journeys that our parents had as they tried to assist kids, it reminds me, what's your name, Ginger, of the point that you made earlier in terms of access. So who do kids go to outside of school when they're struggling with math? Some folks have individuals whom they can go to and can help, and others do not. And so thinking about that as we assign mathematics, that is a social justice action. Otherwise, we're perpetuating it by sending home things that folks need to engage in, knowing that they're just going to get further behind and penalized. But I want to keep thinking about and come back to that idea of humanizing mathematics, One of the things you heard me say earlier is that some research, Danny Martin in particular, Maisie Golson is another one, talks a lot about, Valerie Kinlock is another one, talks a lot about how mathematics can force folks to leave their identities at the door. And so one of the ways that I'm wondering how you get to know your kids is, I'm just wondering that, but I'm also holding up this particular activity called My Fullest Name. Have you heard of it before, My Fullest Name? And so essentially at the beginning of the school year, you ask your students not only to say their name, but to tell the origin or the story or who named them and why they named them that. And what happens is you will hear kids and individuals, if you use it with adults, start to give a legacy of where their family is from and start to share some of their values and assumptions. Why might that be helpful for you? How might that be helpful for you as a math teacher?
Because the more you know about anybody, the more you can connect, the more you can help, the more you can. The reason in general we know how to help our families is because we have so much experience with them. We know what things are helpful. We know what things, in some cases, are triggers. We, so with your students, the more that you know that way, well, this was my granddad's name, and this is, like all this kind of stuff. You get to find out who's important to the students.
Exactly. So again, it's bringing in that humanizing aspect of it. It also allows you to find out what they care about and build rapport. So when things do get hard, you can lean on that. And so the name or the activity of tell me your full name is a good inclusion activity. I'm going to continue to talk about discomfort, and usually when I bring up discomfort, I talk about cognitive conflict and affective conflict. And affective conflict is that type of tension that when you experience, you move into fight or flight. We all have heard about that before, right? So that usually looks like people saying, oh, you know what, I have a doctor's appointment. I'm going to go and I'll talk to you later, and you never see that person again. Affective conflict, that's the below the belt. And then the cognitive conflict is being able to inject a topic, content into the space, in a psychologically safe space that is above the belt, that is not a trigger, that helps push thinking. And so I'm hoping during our conversations that we stay in the cognitive conflict, because my bias is that if it's not a conflict cognitively, we may not be growing as deeply as we could. We're staying too safe. We're having nice conversations and not courageous conversations. What comes to mind when you hear me say that? Are you okay with that? Do you want to leave now? Because you're like, yeah, she's going to get into something? Yeah. So another way of capturing that is in this chart where it talks about safe space, and then it contrasts it against courageous space. And I would add, AKA courageous space again, is where you inject the cognitive conflict. So I'm also astute enough to know that when it's not people physically leaving the room, I know folks can check out mentally, either on technology or side conversations. So my urging and invitation while we're together is when you feel the tension or discomfort, that you not take the natural route of leaving, even if it's mentally, but that you encourage yourself to lean in and ask yourself, what might I learn from this tension? What might this discomfort be teaching me or trying to teach me? So here are the working agreements for today and the next several sessions. Of course, you see that I have bold print for experiencing conflict or discomfort, cognitive conflict. Expect some non-closure. I think that these are complex issues that take multiple opportunities to talk through. And know that my bias is that when we talk, that will lead to deeper understanding on a topic. And what I've learned about some folks when they engage in this work, they want a silver bullet, they want to fix it like that. But guess what? It took some time for it to kind of get to this point. This is a marathon. And so endurance is a good thing. There are multiple strategies that we need to engage in. There are no silver bullets. You read that. And that's one of the ways that you landed here. But for today, the focus is on the tile. I'll ask that you eyeball the 4 bullet points and then identify one that really resonates with you, and I'll get out of your way. Before we move past this, I see this as foundational development. And so this last one, in terms of understanding how we're connected to one another as humans, is key and something that we'll continue to come back to. At KISD and throughout the county, we do a lot around adaptive schools and cognitive coaching. How many of you have been through one or both of those? Okay, awesome. And I see them, kinda. But one of the things that we hold up is that there are 7 norms of collaboration: the pausing, the paraphrasing, posing questions, putting ideas on the table, and not crawling up on the table with the idea, so we can have that psychological safety. It happens. Providing data, paying attention to self and others, and presuming positive intentions. And so please keep those things in mind and know that our role here is simply facilitator. So there may be some items and that you want to press on the content, not the people in the space. The agenda is here, but it will also be anchored here throughout the day, just so you know where we are. And so we're working on what's our why. And to do that, I want to, again, just go back quickly to our working agreements of discomfort. And I want you to either get a scrap sheet of paper or use the Post-its. Oops, sorry about that. And I'm going to ask you to make a prediction, because we're getting into our why of the work. And notice that I use the term Latinx instead of Hispanic, just because we use a lot of gender-laden language, and a part of our DEI work is welcoming everyone. And so that's a better way of being inclusive for some. And checking my gender-laden language. And so here's the task. Either on a scrap sheet of paper, thank you, I didn't turn it off. I'm thinking about it though.
I appreciate it.
Either on a scrap sheet of paper or Post-it, you're going to forecast. We're going somewhere with this. And what you're forecasting is you're going to create a pie chart. You're going to use the different subgroups that are up here. And if you looked at the census, these are pretty much the groups that they would have. And on your pie chart, you're going to give a slice of the pie to each one of the groups. And the slice, how small or large, is your guess of the how large that group will be in 2045. So at the end of our time, in terms of you all creating a pie chart, you'll have a pie chart, you'll have slices, you'll have them labeled using these right here. Some will be tiny because you think that will be a small fraction of the population. Some will be larger because you think it'll be the larger population. What questions might you have? So go ahead and create your pie chart. I was with some non-mathematicians yesterday, and push back and say, no, everybody's a mathematician, right? But I was with some folks yesterday who were claiming they were not, and they were struggling with the percentages. So if you need to do an infographic and just have the picture represent the number, that's cool. So percentages or picture. Any ahas before I show you the next tile? So one database shows the percentages and subgroups are down here, and then you'll see the actual percentages up there. So look at your post-it and see the difference and or similarities to what you have. Bless you. And I want to drill down a little bit. So what I'm going to do is show you 3 additional tiles that drill down from national level to now Kent County. And what the map won't show you is it won't say Kentwood or Cedar or Kennewa, but you'll have a sense of it because it's a county map. The darker the map is, the more diverse it is. Percent of students who are not white is what it's representing. So the darker, the more students they have that are of students of color. This particular map is from 2007. Okay, so the numbers are small, but hopefully you can still read them. This one is 2013. See any changes?
Can you go back 1 minute?
Go back. 2007.
Yep.
2013. What are you noticing?
It's still growing and it's darker from the middle out.
Okay.
And the more complicated than the outside ones.
2017.
Try to get less of
So what surprises you, if anything? Some of you are living this, like you have been in your district long enough to have seen it. I can tell you when I was in the school where I was, when I first entered that school, I could count the number of students of color on my hand. I knew them. And 8 years later, it was a significant change. Probably 5 times as many. I couldn't name each kid of color. I was happy about it because it meant that there was growth. But what surprised you about this data, if anything? You're living it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. What implications might that have on what we do every day?
Making sure that every kid is given equal opportunity in terms of learning and the ability to go beyond just high school, and every kid can go to college if they want to.
Mm-hmm.
And putting that out there so that when we're teaching, that we realize that, and it may be that we have to adjust ourselves and learn new ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Denise is doing it every day. She's one of the teachers that navigates the diversity very well and leverages it as an asset, as a strength. I think it begs the question, 1, are we celebrating and leveraging the diversity? And then 2, how might we need to change our practices to grow more inclusive? Because that does matter in terms of the academic outcomes. And then what biases, if any, might we need to tend to? Especially if we're new to interacting with some of the diversity. Some of us only know diversity from the TV, and what the TV, there's research on media, and it says black males in particular, over 80% of how they're portrayed is usually as thugs, pimps, gangsters, rappers. And so for someone who does not interact with black folks, black males in particular, that does influence how they interact with them, how they intervene, how they teach. Please.
Going to leading educators, ever since I moved to middle school, I always had the question of why is it my African American boys? Because when I had them in elementary school, I taught 3rd or 4th grade, they were right on line with everybody else. What happens to them in middle school? And we had a presenter that kind of said it out loud and said, they were cute little boys when they're in elementary school. When they hit middle school, we start to see them as men and young men, and so our biases get in the way of that, and whether we want to believe that we don't see color or not, that's just a not. It's not out there, and that kind of answered a good question for me.
Absolutely. So thank you for sharing that. And so there's a lot of research out there that talks about, if it's true, that's how media portrays black males. And we know there's also research out there that talks about how we criminalize Latinx as well as black males. And they're in that critical stage of identity development. All of that is interacting to create the things that we're seeing. And so the question then becomes, so how do we change our practices and the conditions in which kids are being schooled in? So that's what social justice is about, and in particular with the math. And so the approach that we'll take as we get into this a little more is the airplane approach. Has anyone flown before? What does she say when she does this right here?
Put your own mask on first.
Exactly.
And then help others.
Exactly. And so it goes back to what Denise was saying in terms of, if we're going to call ourselves engaging in social justice mathematics or social justice practices, it means first stopping and doing our own inside-out work and identifying our own bias and understanding where we're at in relationship to the kids that present in front of us. What do I think about all kids? And then getting real specific in terms of your demographics. What do I think about each one of the groups that my kids represent? Because our work, it's at an individual level in terms of individual agency, what we do day to day. But as I think it was Janine said earlier, there are experiences that groups of people have in terms of micro and macro aggressions. And then there are some systems that are at play. And so how does all of that intersect? And as educators and change agents in our environments, how do we disrupt that to assist our kids? So it starts with us doing our own inside-out work. And so one of the frames that I'll use as we continue to go a little deeper is cultural intelligence. And cultural intelligence basically is, how well do you navigate differences? When you are interacting with someone who appears like you or someone who appears different than you, how well can you navigate that? How well can you check your bias? Can you admit that you have bias? Can you see the color? Can you see that the child is presenting as a transgender? And how does that impact you? And how does your culture impact them? And so cultural intelligence is one of the frames that we'll continue to use. And so within that, there are like 4 big buckets that you can think about and that you can take back. And it's a piece of us doing our own inside-out work. The first question is drive. What's my motivation to even get into this? And right away, you'll see the word diverse. And you need to know, for me, that diversity is inclusive. It is, it's definitely being able to look at race, but it's a lot of other social identifiers too. So I just said transgender. So it's race, it's socioeconomic status, it's gender expression, it's sexual orientation, it's marital status, economics, etc. I have a child that will say more about that, but drive, what's driving you? And my hope is that you're remembering why you first went into education, you're recalling why social justice even peaked, like why are you here, social justice, what peaked for you? But drive is also about those last couple of tiles that we were looking at. Things are changing, and if we're going to maintain our status as being an excellent system for all, we need to know that there's some why work in there. Knowledge, understanding the differences, navigating those. We need to ultimately come up with a strategy, and then we need to put that in action. Here are the social identifiers that I was talking about. Please eyeball them and then add to it. What's missing from this list, if anything? When you think about the students, colleagues, and their support systems, what other social identifiers are present that might appear as different or other that matters? Anything missing?
Thinking about mental health, I don't know if
yes.
there's just a lot of issues that are starting to stem down into some of our students.
I would agree. So the CQ bucket is CQ knowledge, distinguishing the level of understanding about cultures and how they're similar or different. Any questions about any of the ones up there?
Would family dynamics be something because of all of the blended families that our kids are part of now?
Exactly.
Connected to that adoption.
Exactly.
Care.
Exactly. That's good. And so even terminology, when we send communication home in terms of mom, dad, so being sensitive of how that impacts some of those blended families or the descriptions that you just heard. I want to move to the next tile, and I'm sorry that cut off up there, but a part of understanding that systems level approach that we were talking about is also understanding your social identifiers and understanding, like the ladies from Kentwood said, that there is a system at play where our system does benefit some and disadvantages some based on some historical things. And so we have to understand how our identifiers either privileges us or marginalizes us. Say something about what I just said. I want to make sure you're tracking with me. So we all have social identifiers. There's a system at play. The system either positions us to have privilege or advantage, or it can marginalize us. And it varies sometimes, depending on context. What connections might you be making, or what questions might come to mind when you hear me say that? Or what pushback might you have? Then this is what I would invite you to do. Because some of you have done some of this work, and others are just starting. So it's insightful for us, to start listing out our own identifiers. Because the thing that becomes so clear is that some folks have not had to wrestle with some of these things, and some folks have. And so it was helpful for me to write mine because it made more clear for me my privileged identities versus my marginalized. And so some of my social identifiers: Black, female, Christian, married, formally educated, middle class, English speaking, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied, American-born, middle-aged. And so when people see me, they can name my marginalized identities, which sometimes is Black and female, and sometimes they don't see my privileged identities. And most of the time when I present, I'll say Brandy, Lovelady, Mitchell, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And folks will say, well, why are you saying that, or why is that in your tagline? It is a way of heightening consciousness as well as owning my privilege, because as a heterosexual woman, I don't get some of the looks, and I don't have to go through some of the drama as some homosexual couples whom I know. That's me and my privilege by saying, while it's their decision who they choose to love or who loves them, I still hold space for them to be fully authentic in their humanity. You tracking with me? And then the word that usually catches people up is cisgendered. Everybody know? Okay. So
I was curious what that was actually.
So one, the able-bodied piece. I'm up here walking around. Remember earlier I said, can everybody get around and move okay? So able-bodied. But the cisgendered in terms of I was born a female. I still express myself as a female. And whether we agree with it or not, we have kids in our spaces who have a different gender expression now than when they were born. Let me make that more plain. They were born male, but now they present as female. And so how are we with those kids? Do we still hold space for them? Safe space? Do we still engage them in a way that is humanizing? And in many schools, how it's showing up is where they get to use the restroom or not. And so my invitation for you is that you continue to think about this tile, because this will help start inside out work, and that you start listing out your own identifiers. And then we go to this. So I remember coming across Dr. Janice Hale, who was from Wayne State, actually back in Kentwood. And her research was about cultural mismatch, basically. But I remember her talking so vividly, and the picture that I kept getting was a Venn diagram. my math teacher must have done well, right? And so what I kept thinking about in terms of what she was saying is, make sure this is not permanent. Who makes up the teaching workforce? Let's use the social identifiers.
Female.
Who?
Female.
Female. There are three big ones that I'm looking for. Female. What else?
White. Predominantly white.
White. What else? What language?
English.
Usually English. I say English. Usually English. Usually English, which I can't speak very well right now. Socioeconomic status.
Middle class.
Middle class. I remember her talking and having this picture. So she talked about, when our students are also white and female, all of that connects. So that's this part right here. When our students, and we're white, females, maybe it's not, their connectedness is what? Their whiteness. So tracking with me? So keep playing that out. Ooh, that's not good. Keep playing that out. So if they're black and male, there's not this organic connection or organic overlap. And so again, it goes back to CQ strategy. Then what do you do? And how have you checked your bias in terms of the criminalization of certain groups? You tracking with me? And so what I would encourage you to do as we're doing our inside out work is go back to this and think about your social identifiers. Think about the kids whom you interact with on a regular basis and do the Venn diagram. And then go back to the CQ strategy and action. So what have you intentionally done to deposit in the relationship of those kids where there might not be any organic overlap? And what bias might we hold, if any? And maybe you feel like you've already done that work. I hope you have. That would be great. The question is, how might you respond? That's the action and strategy. But the fact is, what most people try to deny is, they try to say we don't have bias. But the fact is, if you're living and if you have a brain, we have bias. And usually it's a good thing. It usually saves us. But there are some instances where it can create some very negative results and actually tee up disproportionality. And so there's research that talks about when there is this disconnect, so the circles aren't overlapping and they're like this, when there's this disconnect and there's some discomfort around our social identifiers, even your best teacher's efficacy goes down. And so again, it begs the question of, have you done this work, the inside out work, and then also looking at how it overlaps, and when it overlaps, intentionally created a strategy to help you be a bridge. So what connections are you making? What connections are you making? So turn to an elbow partner, someone close to you, and this is your opportunity to kind of share, because here's what I know. These interactions are much like gum chewing. You can only put so much gum in your mouth before you have to start chewing, right? Like talking. So that's where we're at. We're at the gum in the mouth. It's full talk. Okay? So please talk. What connections are you making? And please pause. Please pause. Anything that you either said or heard that you think would benefit the group. And you don't have to say, but I want to give you the opportunity because I know you're wise and you have a lot of insight. So anything that the group wants to share.
Going back to the slide about the social identifiers, and you were talking about areas of privilege versus parts of your identifiers that are marginalized. And if it is an identifier where you have privilege, there are a lot of voices, and you hear about that perspective often. But if it's from one that is a marginalized identifier, you either don't hear voices from that perspective, or you get like one. So I shared like one is that I'm Asian. So a lot of times like I'm expected to know all Asian languages, everything about all Asian culture, Asian history, like every country in Asia, which is a lot. And then the other part, I'm adopted, and so same thing. I'm expected to speak for every person who's adopted, and I know like I'm Korean, so there are 200,000 of us, and I have one perspective. So if you identify as a marginalized for one of these, then you don't often hear about them, or it's just a few voices.
So thank you for saying that. And so some of the effective practices that we have seen around that is one, so being very mindful even of our artifacts in terms of when we tour your space, who's represented and how are they represented, and in the curriculum, how are we telling stories? And so I'm reminded of people talking about Rosa Parks and understanding that it was way more comprehensive than what we normally say, or Dr. King, or other heroes that don't have the same light or attention that we give folks. But Celine is also bringing up the research that talks about there's a burden, a tax that's placed on teachers of color when they're in predominantly white spaces, in terms of being the teacher not only of students and content, but being the teacher and the holder of culture. And so how might we check ourselves on that? Does that make sense? And it really is a burden. That's what she's talking about, the burden of it. And she talked about the manifestation of this in terms of, so while we were talking about, remember the different levels I talked about? What were the three levels? Remember, what was this one? There were three levels. I'm helping. Individual. Remember, individual, group, and then structural. And so what Celine was talking about is, if it's true that most of our teachers are white women, there is a white middle class culture in which our kids are schooled in, and having to understand how that impacts them. Because the analogy that I used earlier is that some kids, when they enter school or enter specific spaces, they feel dehumanized because some of their social identifiers are stripped. In subtle and sometimes in direct ways, they're told that doesn't belong here, and that is a social identifier that's very important to them. Can you think of how that manifests or festers? Festers is a better word. Can you think of how that festers? What might be examples of how we ask kids to check social identifiers at the door? What might be a way? Another example or two.
I think culturally everybody approaches things differently. I find that my Hispanic kids often don't want to, or the Latinx or
whatever
they don't all often want to volunteer, because a lot of times they'll say, well, we're taught to respect the teacher and to be very quiet. And I think a lot of my other kids, there'll be kids who are told that you have to sit and be quiet, and at home that's not.
Right.
That's not how it works for them at home.
Right.
If they have a disagreement at home, they fight it out tooth and nail. Well, here, if you have a disagreement, you're just supposed to sit there and listen to the adult. And that's economic, because some kids who live in really poor situations have a hard time because they're treated differently and they're talked to differently, and they've got a different perspective on how you handle conflict. So just even those things.
It's there's a lot of beautiful nuggets in what Denise said, and the social justice aspect of it is, and so how do you frame what she just said? Do you frame it as a deficit perspective in terms of the kids don't care, they're not engaged? Or do you dig in and say what cultural implications might be at play? And so when they're not talking, it's not necessarily disrespectful, but it's them actually trying to be respectful because it's a cultural theme. So there is always some culture that is at play. What other comments or connections did you all make? Uh-oh, am I going the wrong way? This is where we were. Other connections? Go ahead.
I teach a refugee program, so everybody I have is a minority. Everywhere from doesn't speak a word of English, never been to school, to bilingual, trilingual, who knows what kind of transcripts need like 1 credit and they're done. And a lot of those things on there, the kids fight against each other a lot also. So not only are we trying to teach them and figure all of that out, but also get them to stop fighting with each other because, well, you're from here and they're from here, or, you know, what is a common insult in America now becomes you just insulted my mother, even though that might not really be where we're going, and it just turns into a whole class disaster. And so nobody that I teach is in the majority, and so it's just a whole different thing. So I'm trying to figure out what parts of it are going to be helpful in my school, and but yet I know these kids are also dealing with all sorts of things when they leave school for jobs, or the fact that they don't have a family at home, or they, you know, the whole thing is just very.
It is, and so it becomes important to be able to get to know the kids, to understand what they value, and to also be able to create a space where they can agree to certain behaviors and also be their authentic selves. And that goes as far as not harming the other person, right? So still getting to know them. I put an article in front of each of you, and that's where I wanted to go next. It's knowing your why, because there are at least 3 position papers that math organizations have put out on the importance of social justice in math. And I wanted to spend some time on that, but it's 2 o'clock and I was told that this was the time that you all were supposed to do your implementation guide. So what I want to do is just say, let's hold space for that. Let's just press pause. It's there. I want to get into a couple of other things, and it's still, we're going to do that jigsaw with that. But how many of you have seen this? First 2 or all 4?
First
3.
Yeah. First 3.
Yeah. So, and it's a little blurry here, but what I love about it is a great graphic that really highlights the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the fact that most of us have seen the first 2 at least, and now there's 4, helps us understand how iterative that this is in terms of social justice in math. Is highlighting the humanity and allowing people to evolve. And so they may enter your classroom at one level, but giving them the opportunity to continue to evolve and to learn versus having a fixed mindset and not using labels or deficit models to describe them. What connections or how might you describe what you're seeing here? It's a metaphor, and a metaphor of what? How does this connect with social justice in math? How does this connect to school in general?
Because we don't all need the same thing to be able to have success. Equality is giving everybody exactly the same thing, but obviously everybody, you know, the little guy in the purple shirt can't see anything anyway, on one piece. And the guy in the blue shirt can see it before, so it doesn't really need to be that much higher. And so being able to figure, I mean, in that case it's literally height, but being able to figure out what do they need.
And the other, so in addition to what you're saying, which I totally agree with, Beth, is look at this now through the lens of engagement. What do you notice about engagement? And what has changed that correlates perhaps with the level of engagement? What do you see? What do you notice?
Well, obviously liberation is like everybody's really engaged versus like even when you get to equity, the kid in the red shirt, he's, you know, he can see now, but is he really engaged in the game or not?
When I'm looking at the reality, it reminds me of a traditional classroom and the students who are successful in a traditional classroom, and that teacher advocates to keep continuing to teach as a traditional teacher because students are successful. It's probably the students that would be successful in any type of classroom, and how we as educators need to think about the needs of the students and not just doing what we've always done.
Doing what we've always done, and or thinking that by giving everyone a box that's helpful, equity is meeting kids where they are. I would ask you to look here and see how this kid is still alienated. And so while they may have many boxes and their perspective may be different so they can see everything, there's still a significant level of alienation that's happening. And what it reminds me of, because folks say that this is a privileged student, but what I would say is we can think of all kinds of stories across the nation or even perhaps locally of kids that are at schools that are well-resourced, but they're making huge mistakes related to their cross-cultural communication and interactions. So I think of the picture of the kids at the Ivy School that were black-faced. So one of the things that we have to also recognize in this is that nobody wins when we allow our current structures to operate the way that they're operating. Yes, this kid may have more resources, but they certainly are not learning how to interact successfully with other students from them. There's still this barrier here, which spoke to the systems issues that some folks spoke to earlier. And then this almost looks like a grave. And it recognizes, again, that some kids start much further behind. And then, how many of you have kids in the room? Anybody? Okay. Would you want your kids standing here during a baseball game? Raise your hand if you would want your kids standing here during a baseball game.
From being able to see or from the protection behind the wall?
That is my question.
Yeah.
Right?
Because the truth is, if I can take away a wall and make everybody be able to see the game the best that they can, that I want. Do I want them to be able to get hit by the ball and get knocked out? No, I don't. So there is a protection that I want, but there's also a freedom of having access to it at the same time. So I can see good and scary in that picture.
And I would agree, and I would just push to say that this is a great graphic that helps us start talking about DEI, but it's still problematic.
DEI, exactly.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sorry, thanks for asking. But there's still a problem. Like, I wouldn't want Marcus and Silas still standing here because of the threat of the ball, but also the alienation. Like, I want my kids to be able to sit in the box seats with anybody else, or in the box office, the suite, or how about owning the team? So there's still a level, hierarchy perhaps in this, and then we're still having, it appears like kids of color over here. So there are still some problems with this picture. And it also speaks to just that deficit view that we can have. And so the social justice injection into schools, or math in particular, is being able to know that there is a system at play and that we have to strive to improve. And even when we are good, that sometimes good is not good enough, that we need to push even a little more. Go ahead, please.
The reality image looks pretty dangerous. And looking through the lens of powerful white men and the Me Too movement, or you know, that we see it in the news every day.
That's right. That's right. Right?
So that position is
exactly. It's dangerous.
Dangerous.
That it is dangerous
for them and for others.
That's right. Say more. Can you say more about that?
Well, I mean, the news is there's something new every day.
Yeah.
And people have been hurt.
That's right. People have been hurt in both ways, and that again goes to this dehumanizing factor, because when this person is up here, they're on a pedestal, and they can adopt a mindset of, I am above all and can do anything, anytime, any way that I want. Me too, right? That's the Me Too movement. And it goes directly to what we were saying earlier in terms of color blindness. Color blindness. So not only when you say you don't see color, are you stripping me as something that's very important to me in terms of my blackness or Asianness, is what you said earlier, but you also are failing to recognize that you bring whiteness to the table. And you'll never interrogate that and the manifestation of it if we're colorblind, or if we continue to let things be like this. And my fear is that if we're not engaging kids in this conversation and building up skills and letting them see the inequities, that none of our kids will be ready to adopt this global multicultural world, and that they will continue to make some of the mistakes that we've seen a whole bunch of people make. You tracking with me? And so here's a different image that still illuminates DEI and just really tries to emphasize that we need on-ramps for people and that there are systemic barriers. This one I've just added arrows to help you think about social justice. What it sounds like and looks like in schools is paying attention to engagement. And sometimes those kids that we say are naughty, they're being good, their best version of good. They can't be good at the math or the content, and so they're going to be the best naughty kid in the school to get the attention and affirmation that they need. And sometimes when we say that kids have dropped out, they've actually been pushed out by our system, the conditions of the school, because we're not inclusive. They don't see themselves in the staff or in the curriculum. And what I want to say about that is, while we are working hard on recruiting more teachers of color, in the meanwhile, there are other ways that you can inject diversity into your classroom as well as your school. What might be an example? How do you all do it now?
Images, choice of read alouds.
Right? It's those like simple things, and then it's connecting with community partners to introduce them, but be mindful of the barriers and the pitfalls. So notice the red arrows, the fence, and then the actual pit or grave, and then the alienation that happens with the person on the multiple boxes as well as the kids that are over there. Here's where we really want to be in terms of not a deficit model, but leveraging diversity like this in terms of I recognize, I see the differences, and the mechanism, schooling, or in this case the bike. I'm going to give you a different type of bike to engage you, to ensure that you can really be your authentic self and participate. We talked a little bit about color blindness. But when we are colorblind, we cause folks to feel like they can't be their authentic selves, and they'll hide or feel like they have to negotiate who they are in order to be present. How many of you seen the article of, actually there have been several articles about, actually it's been about little black girls and their afros or their braids and how they've been kicked out of school. Have you seen that? That's a very blatant way that we engage in this deficit model. It's actually quite racist. And so we do this, whether it's extreme or something more subtle, but it has a negative impact on our kids. So my question, again, is when you look at this, and when you think about the demographics in your school, who might we need to spend more time learning about in general? That's that group level. And everybody's experience is different. And then, who might we be erasing? Who might we be erasing with some of our structures and our practices? I would urge you almost to think about your next lesson planner. Is everybody here a classroom teacher, administrator, classroom teacher? Okay. So whatever role you hold in your system, I would offer that you look at your demographics, that you almost write one of the social identifiers on one of these, so one per, or index card. And the next time you're thinking about your next lesson plan or your initiative or your policy, you think about the kids who continue to show up as most marginalized. How might this impact them? Or how might I reach them in this lesson? How might I tweak it? How might I bring in their culture into this? How might I really amplify their voice? Because we know usually it's white middle class. The deficit thinking in general is the bias-based beliefs that set the stage for us to have so many discipline issues, as well as referrals to special education. So there's this case study that talks about, one, the number of black and brown kindergartners and first graders who have been suspended for 3 or more days as a kindergartner or first grader. Outstandingly. I'm like, I don't understand it. And then when they go on to dig in, they're talking about implicit bias. And the research talks about actually conducting a study where they had a classroom and they had 2 or 3 teachers, and they were close to the teachers, and the teachers couldn't see the kids, but they heard mischief. And so they looked or corrected the black and brown kids, and then when the video was played back, the black and brown kids were nowhere near. But it's that implicit bias in terms of what beliefs do we hold about all kids. And so one of the things that I hear often is that, again, we're not biased. And so I hope the conversations that you have with your peers, colleagues, is what if we were and didn't know? Or how might we find out? And so there are all kinds of implicit bias assessments. How many of you remember MTV? Yeah? Okay. And so if you were to do a Google search for MTV Bias Cleanse, MTV Bias Cleanse, you can sign up, you put in your email, and each day, over a course of like 5 to 7 days, it'll give you a different prompt. And the intention is, I'm going to give you this prompt to raise your consciousness so you can kind of monitor it. It's better to do it with someone whom you trust so then you can process it. The other thing is just in general, don't even focus on yourself, but focus on other people. Because it's easier sometimes with stuff like this to focus on other people. Keep a journal. Keep a journal, and then just see how many times you see bias cropping up. And then process it. And then the next step would be, as you process it with your friend, your critical friend, talk about how you might interrupt it. What article might you share, and or what resource might you share to help give words to how you might interrupt it?
Can you repeat that?
Which MTV one?
Yeah.
In MTV Bias Cleanse, here are 2 more. And we will likely, if you come back, we will likely interact with a couple of these resources. Kirwan Institute, Kirwin, Ohio State. Kirwan Institute. They have great modules on implicit bias, and it doesn't take long to go through. And then, I can say this one aloud, Harvard. Harvard has an implicit bias assessment. And so my urging is that you start with your department and you choose one or more of those and you explore it with them to see what dialogue comes up, and also pair it with looking at your data. Your data in terms of attendance, discipline, referrals to special education, and then academic performance. Why might I say attendance? How might attendance matter in that? What correlation are you making with that?
Obviously, if you're feeling like your identity is being stripped, why would you want to be there?
Right?
And different, especially for us, different cultures have different impressions or beliefs on how important it is to actually go to school. We have huge groups of kids, typically from a certain geographic area, that just kind of show up randomly. Like, this gets way better for everybody if you're here more often. And it's still a battle that we struggle with all the time, because they don't come from it being important, or the school they went to there. You could show up once every once in a while and still be fine.
So it's all over the place, and so some folks will say that they really value education, yet their parents, if they speak more than one language, that their parents needed them to be the interpreter. And my wondering about that is, what's the social justice response in terms of that child has a lot of skills because they're navigating the world for their parents. And what skills might we amplify in a school setting about that? And how might we get an interpreter, perhaps, or identify a family or a friend that might help parents so a child can be in school? And other times I say, what's the story behind that? If they're not showing up, it's not just that they don't value it. Sometimes there are other things. And so maybe in one of the future sessions we'll do a triangle activity, which also helps to illuminate some of that. But here are some very concrete examples of some ways that math teachers have intersected social justice and math. And basically, these are themes. And the whole social justice movement in schools is about how do you allow community inside school? How do you allow community issues that kids care about? How do you bring that into the school system and create projects around that matter for the kids and engage them? So another way might be some of our kids are experiencing gentrification. So what are the ways in which math intersects with gentrification? Some of our kids are concerned about the Flint water crisis. How might you bring that into a math unit? Some of our kids are obsessed with what's happening with Kaepernick right now and Nike or the kneeling. How might you bring some of the economic type things that are happening into the math setting? So social justice in schooling or math is about how do you bring issues that matter to kids into the classroom so they know that what's happening outside of the four walls matter. The handout that I'm giving you now is like 12 tiles ahead, but I want to make sure you leave with some additional resources. And so this one is one that you can search online, but it's basically a teacher's draft of some projects where outside things that really matter to his or her students became projects for the school. And what he talked about is not every project has to intersect with social justice, but if you show kids that you care about what's happening to them outside of school, and if you're addressing inequities with them, they'll show up and they will engage. And it also humanizes math in terms of it's not just about equations, but there are applied real-life ways of using the concepts that we're grappling with. Someone trying to get in? I don't think it's live. Okay. Okay. So the next couple of tiles talk about culturally responsive ways of teaching. This tile to me just really captures some of the things that have been said in the room in terms of, and actually, can somebody read that?
The more culturally competent we are as adults, the less our students have to play give it up in our presence. And the less pressure they feel to not be who they are, the more energy they have available to engage and learn.
And so it goes back again to those social identifiers and us thinking about the ways in which we ask kids to check their identifiers at the door. I want to pause a second. I'm going to give you this also. Because a part of being interested in social justice or even being culturally competent is being able to say, I see you. Like, I see you, student, for who you are and your full humanity, and I see the struggles, and what matters to you matters to me, and I'm going to advocate to disrupt some of the inequities. And so some of those assignments kind of highlight ways in which you might do that instructionally, but it also means being an advocate, and so that's what the ally document is about. And then the first document that I gave you really explicates the why in terms of why more mathematicians are talking about social justice. What I want to do is give you a couple of seconds to peruse the documents. In particular, this document right here, I would love for you won't have an opportunity to read the whole thing, but at least go through and look at the subheadings, because I think it'll catch your eye. Because my fear is that you'll have these documents and you'll be like, that's just a lot of words on a piece of paper. But if you go through and put a little asterisk by subheadings that catch your attention, perhaps it will encourage you to revisit it later when you have left here. Because I know when I looked at the subheadings, I found them intriguing, like the gatekeeper and deficit views and belief systems. So let me give you a second to go through and put an asterisk in the margin of the ones that are intriguing to you, because it'll allow you to hopefully invite yourself to revisit it. And I want to give you an opportunity to do the work that Rusty, Marcus, and Andrew would like for you to do. And so before I kind of segue into that, I'll say this. So the social justice, the DEI, the cultural intelligence work is really inside out work. And it's the heavy lifting, it's messy. And I joke with the math team frequently because they like things precise. They like things precise. I joke with them all the time. I really mess with them all the time about precision. And this is not precise work. It gets really messy quickly, but it is transformative work. And it's the work that matters most given what's happening in our schools and nation. And so I urge you to prime your hearts and mind as you go deeper in this work. And I'll leave you with Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings' quote about culturally responsive teaching. In the next house, kind of unpack it more. But this is what it is. Social justice at the heart, as well as culturally responsive teaching. It is an approach that empowers students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically by using cultural reference to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And so the big question really is, if we know that our current ways are stripping and or oppressing kids and even our colleagues from bringing their best selves, their most authentic selves, you might think of it like my friend Ruth, who talked about, wouldn't it be just like our designer of Earth to have planted the cure or the solution to a complex problem in one of those folks who feel like they have been oppressed and ultimately falls through the cracks? Wouldn't it be just like our designer to have put the cure or the answer to a complex problem in their brain? Because the emphasis should be on our interconnectedness and how we allow all folks to be their full selves in our spaces. So I hope you think about that as you go forward. And I'm going to encourage you, if you have a laptop or phone, to think about some of the questions that Rusty, Marcus, and Andrew have posed for you. And the way you access that is by following the directions that are on this tile. Have you all done this before? The Classroom Google? Okay, the Google Classroom, excuse me. Okay, so got a little refresher. So it says go to classroom.google.com, sign into one of your Google accounts, and then click the plus sign at the top. Click join class, and then I'll forward it so then you see the code. Here is the code. So that's the title, and then the code is QHD364. Oh, darn it. QHD364.
It's at the bottom left.
Oh, awesome. It's on your gold sheet also. Thank you, Ginger. And something else that I would invite you to do before you leave is two different things. I'm going to grab this chair. Thank you. Make sure you sign into this right here. I want to send you a couple of resources electronically. So that's one way that I'll use this. And Marcus, Rusty, and Andrew use this as well. And I'm not quite sure why or how. And then two, there are still Post-its near you. And so what I would love for you to do is there may be something circling in your mind right now, like something that you need more resources on, and knowing that this is a beginning conversation, and or certain things that you want to get into if you elect to come back. Write those things on a Post-it and then place them on this gray push pin board, okay? So things that are circling on your mind right now, so things that you're questioning, want more research on or something, resources on, or topics that you definitely want to get into related to social justice and math, place that on a Post-it, one item per Post-it, and then place the Post-it over here on the gray push pin board. So my understanding is that this is an evolving document.
Yes.
and that this very first entry is very basic in terms of the session. And then they want you to think about implementation. Like, they don't want it to be one of those interactions that you've had that stops at the end of the day and does not integrate into your practices. And so what might you do? Commitment based on student need. What might you do? So I might even think back to some of the social identifiers. Who might you need to learn more about? Like, whose story or what community connections might you make in order to make an intentional effort to showcase certain cultures in your room in a positive light? How might you interact with some of the resources that we talked about related to bias? And then how might you incorporate some of your colleagues in that? So that those may be some of the avenues that you take as you think about this. So remember the invitation about the Post-its on the gray pushpin board. If you don't get an email from me by the 28th with resources, you might want to reach out to me because some reason I've missed you, because there are at least 4 documents that I want to send electronically. And if you've already completed the implementation guide, hey, we are, well, I shouldn't say we because I'm not completing the implementation guide, but folks are interacting with the implementation guide right now.
How's it feeling?
The implementation guide?
Yeah, are we able to find it? Life is good, technology's cooperating.
There's a turn-in button. Is that for each session or for the final session?
You don't have to hit turn in.
Okay.
That actually causes more problems when you do, but either way we can figure it out. If you do it locks it, so then we have to go in and unlock it.
Okay.
So just leave it open, and then that'll just allow us to continue to edit and put comments on it. Yeah. If you already did, don't stress out. Life is good. We can undo it.
Cool. Thank you.
Everything else is good?
Yes. And so I think I'm going to give it maybe like 3 more minutes, and then there are 2 reflective questions that we should wrestle with as a group. It should be good.
Cool. And then the survey is at the end. The bit.ly should be on a slide that's coming up. Yep.
Right
that
there?
One right there. That bit.ly will take you to the survey. If you could just fill that out before you go so that we can adjust any things that we might want to moving forward.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all.
So I'll leave this here just in case some folks are in need of it now. And then at 2:40, what I'll do is go back to those 2 questions that they're posing. Here are the 2 questions at the bottom of this tile. I'm going to read them and ask that everyone think about it, and then we'll process it as a whole group. What might be some things that are vital to communicate back to your building mathematics team? What might be some things that are vital to communicate back to your building mathematics team? Secondly, what might be an avenue to communicate important learning back to your school? So is there a structure you can use to share some of the learnings from the day with your school? What might that be? Maybe it's a PLC or a critical friend session that you have with other folks. And so let's go back to the first one. Give everyone about 40 seconds to individually think, and then I'll ask for folks to share. What might be some things that are vital to communicate back to your building mathematics team? And maybe let's start here. So I wasn't with you the whole day. Might somebody share a summary of your earlier sessions? I know right before this, you all broke out by district, if I'm correct. But what was the first part of the morning like? And then let's get into some of the things that you'll want to communicate back to your math team. Anybody?
We talked about the difference between professional development and professional learning,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the ways that we do professional learning, and then we also talked about the framework for mathematics.
Okay, thank you. And so given that, what might be some things that you want to take back to your math team? Some schools can only send one person, and some can send the whole group. But what might you share back in your school, given today's learning, if anything? What might you reinforce that you're already doing? Or what might you say, let's rethink this one, and here's why?
We had some discussion in the district about just keeping in the forefront of our minds the difference between professional development and professional learning, and how do we engage people to invite them to take part in something more than just, hey, this is what we're going to teach you. So how do we get them to bite at that? How do we engage them to
go deeper?
How do we get them to say, we want to know more about that?
Has anyone done that and been successful and want to share? How have you caused the shift is basically what she's saying.
We have some of that too. Some people are totally on board, and some people are not. One of the things our coach talked about is the idea of creating a headache, and then this is the aspirin that takes care of it. So the first part is really, what is the issue, what is the challenge, where is the discomfort, and then that's really what is the motivator to get them on board and to buy in. Because without the buy-in, it's just, you're just sitting there and it's just bouncing off whatever we're trying to share. So we have some of both. So I don't know, it's just
No, I know.
But it sounds like you're amplifying. Look for the entry point, wherever that is. That may be a place to start, and letting that don't buffer the tension or the discomfort that might be the very trigger that they need to change. Were you going to say something, Pam?
Just kind of along that line.
Okay.
I almost think that tension needs to be created sometimes.
Yes.
Because it's not there.
Yes.
And everybody's comfortable.
Yes.
And they don't want it.
And how do you do that?
Yeah.
How do you do that? How have you all been successful in creating tension or urgency or that burning platform?
Well, sometimes it's just the data itself. A lot of times, looking really closely at, the data kind of says this or that. I mean, I know with leading educators, we've been taking some of the perception data for our teachers, and then when they have to see it back, it's whoa, wait, we really don't know what we thought we knew. And so then that kind of drives the, you said, the headache. I like that analogy. Because then they're like, wait a minute, maybe we need to learn something different here.
Because if some people are still living in a bubble, that they don't know that there's this discomfort or problem because it doesn't impact them significantly enough. And so, yes, the data sometimes will do it. And the good thing about the data is that it's third party in terms of it's not you, but here's the paper, here's the data. Now, everybody line up over here. We're all together. What are we going to do about that? Yes, so I would agree. Other items in terms of what you're taking back to your school?
Brandy, I'm just wondering, this slide deck you went through with us today, the tiles, is that going to be in the Google Classroom?
It won't be in the Google Classroom, but if there was a tile that you resonated with in particular, let me know, and then I'll send it to you. Yeah.
The Venn diagram piece was...
Janice Hale. Yeah, so that's the research, but and so I told you I mess with the math team all the time about the precision. So they mess with me all the time about my pictures. I need pictures to...
Can I ask you a question about that, though?
Yeah.
Technically, what's in the intersection would be what's the same between the
Yeah.
teacher and the student.
That's right.
But your bias wouldn't be what's the same.
No.
Your bias should be when they're separate.
That's right. And that's exactly it. And so my illustration earlier was if it's white, female, what's connecting them is white femaleness. If it's white female, white male, what's connecting is white. If it's white female, black male, it's one circle here, one circle here.
True.
I just didn't draw it out.
Though,
Yeah.
It had the red. said
Oh.
and it said that's the bias.
Yeah.
I'm like, but that isn't
Yeah,
the bias.
no.
So that's why I was
Let me
just
tell
curious
you
about
why that's like that. That was really more cosmetic because it's yellow and it wasn't showing up well, and I wanted you to see it. I wanted to emphasize, you're exactly right in terms of the concept. What I was also trying to say is that bias is detrimental. And we say often that this is West Michigan and we're nice, but it's not nice to not check your bias. And it has gotten to the point where our bias is injecting a slow violence in terms of kids' performance and not engaging in school, and even sometimes just straight up hard violence. And so you're right. Bias is when it's like this, and it has many different implications. This is what she's talking about. That was a cosmetic thing. Me wanting the yellow and the red. Yeah.
More
Yeah.
the fact that the bias was the spot in the middle. Whatever
Right.
the color, the bias
Right.
is the outside stuff.
Yeah.
not the inside stuff.
It's on the red and black because it's yellow, and I wanted you to see it. Bias, the picture of bias would be out, right? The bias is separating. We're thinking the same thing. The picture does not illustrate it. So let me move it.
The way the Venn diagram would be is if there is no intersection. But
It's
there's
like
no
this.
intersection. If that part is empty,
Yeah.
if that part ends up being empty, because we sometimes get sets like that where everything is here and there
Right.
is no intersection,
Right.
that is the bias.
Yeah.
When it's empty.
Right. But to me, it would have been less confusing to have two separate circles and say the bias is the fact that there's nothing intersecting. That's where I was having trouble.
Yeah, I would agree.
So.
I would agree. That's the precision of a math mind. But I would agree. Yes.
I know I do get stuck in details.
That's okay. That's okay. It's
I have a
good.
husband who's very much a non-math person, and we have detailed discussions. Just some things, like, I'm like, but that's not what it says. He's like, but this is what it means.
Mhm.
It's not the same thing.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Mhm. Agreed. Okay. So those are the questions, and then let's see. There's an evaluation at the very end, and so Rusty talked about a bit.ly for your overall experience, and that's where you can find the survey in yellow. Is it up there? Yep. Okay, and then I want to show you the last tile from Marcus, Rusty, and Andrew. So in our coaching conversations related to how do you really integrate this into your identity and into your day-to-day practices, it has been important to really explicate, so you've been through today, now what? And so the question that they're posing is, what skills or behaviors do you look forward to bringing or taking back to the students in your classroom as a result of all of today's learning? What skills or behaviors do you look forward to taking back to your students, to your classrooms or building level as a result of today's learning? So how is the professional development, professional learning conversation going to matter tomorrow or next week? That's one question.
I help lead content cycles, so I think some of it might not be directly, it'll affect students, but it's not directly bringing it back to my classroom, but then talking to those teachers that I work with about just differences in professional learning versus professional development, and looking at the teaching framework for mathematics and how we plan and do things for mathematics.
So there's some diversity in the room in terms of roles, and that's a perfect example. Any other examples in terms of how this is going to impact whomever you call students, the PD versus the professional learning? How might that one trickle back?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, so we're talking about Oh, that's okay. Was everyone able to complete it? No? Okay. Let me be quiet. You go ahead and fill out the form.
Can you go back so that I can see
The Bitly? Yeah. Go ahead and fill out the form. So it's almost 3, and you can stay as long as you need to finish the Bitly and whatever else you need to. My invitation is also for you to put something on a post-it and put it over here if you want. And I hope you have a great day.